Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. In this episode we have another look at our canine cryptid and cousin of the werewolf, the Dogman. I hope you enjoy these cryptid stories. Until today. I'm not sure what it was, but I'm sure it had nefarious intentions. I was born and raised in the Ann Arbor, Michigan area my entire life, and have never encountered anything strange or unusual. As an avid hiker and outdoorsman, I've seen it all in terms of wildlife. I know that much of my adolescence and early 20s were riddled with stories about the supposed dogman who lives out in the wilderness, but I have never encountered such a thing, or so I thought until it happened to me just a month ago. I'm still having difficulty processing what happened. As I'm hiking through the woods, I usually like to hike on a traverse through miles and miles of wilderness. I just had this strange feeling that I'm being watched, and it's making me more and more uncomfortable as I walk. I keep looking around and checking my surroundings, but I don't see anything. After a short period of time, maybe not even a half hour later, the woods start to become silent. For those of you who aren't into the outdoors, this usually happens when there is a large predator in the area, such as a mountain lion. The only thing that comes to mind is a black bear, which is the only type of bear found in Michigan, but I seriously doubt a black bear would stalk me like this. I've dealt with black bears in the past, but never had an experience remotely comparable to what I was having with any black bear, so I continued to track back to my truck, having only gone about 3 or so miles into the woods. That's when I noticed the sweet smell of death, rotting meat, and wet dog. It was so strong at this point that I picked up the pace and began jogging back to my truck. I knew whatever I was smelling wasn't far away. And as soon as I began jogging, I could hear something keeping up with me. Whatever it was, it couldn't have been more than 20 yards behind me. I refused to turn around and look, and I literally kept going until I reached the tree line, ran to my truck, and got the hell out of there. What's strange and frightening is that whatever this was could have easily gotten me and taken me out, but it didn't. It just kept up with me. It seems to be attempting to evict me from its domain. It's going to have a huge impact now. I guess there are just some things in the wilderness based on the way I hike and where I hike. We were never meant to discover my encounter occurred when I was 19 and a little younger. My parents split up in a nasty divorce but always lived within 5 miles of each other. So that my brother and I could travel back and forth while maintaining a healthy relationship with both of our parents. We lived in a more rural area, so we would often just walk to the other parent's house. To give you an idea, one of the most popular ways we would do this is to walk the dike to my dad's house. A dike connects the upper part of town where my mother lives to the lower part of town, which is a few miles away. You can now take this small path that runs alongside the train tracks and a river. This path is known as a dike. As you walk there, you'll notice a 20-foot clearing on your left, followed by the woods. On your right, there is a small drop-off of about 5 or 7 feet, followed by some train tracks, more brush, the riverbank, and finally the river. This pathway is quite long and extends for a few miles, with only a few streetlights here and there. On this particular night, me and my brother, who were 1916 at the time, are walking from my mother's to my father's down this dike. It's around 8 o'clock, and it was definitely dark out, so it wasn't summer yet. Keep in mind that we are the only ones out walking this right now, which is fairly common for us because we walk this dike frequently, and we know that there is relatively low traffic on this particular night, even though we were walking and we began hearing some strange noises by the riverbank. It's not all that unusual. Sometimes homeless people and younger kids like to drink and party down there. So we didn't give it much thought. However, the noises we did hear sounded like a horse or something large was trapped and trying to escape, or something along those lines. I honestly don't know how else to put it. It was simply strange. But all I could make out was that whatever was making this noise was enormous once more. I kept walking and didn't give it much thought until I was about 50 feet away. This massive thing runs up from the train tracks to the dike directly beneath the streetlight. It ran up on all fours, and as soon as it got onto the pathway, it stood up on two legs and looked directly at me and my brother. At this point, both me and him came to a halt and nearly pissed ourselves. My brother and I both said werewolf with almost a whimper, and I remained completely silent while watching the thing. This thing stood there for a brief moment, just staring at me and my brother, before leaping into the woods to her left. I thought it was a wolf at first, but as soon as it climbed onto the path, I realized it was the biggest dog I'd ever seen. Then, when it stood up, I didn't know what to think other than a werewolf. It wasn't super ripped, but it was lean and had a more slender, tapered off waist. And I did notice a rather bushy tail. The head was quite large and resembled that of a wolf. Consider a timber wolf. And I could see under the light that it had dark brown hair with distinctive streak patterns. The most terrifying aspect of it, however, was the way it looked at us. It didn't snarl, instead, it smiled sinisterly, as if it wanted us to come to it so it could do evil. Its eyes were nearly piercing red. Even now, the story is difficult for me to recall because of how traumatizing it was for both of us, despite the fact that it only stood there staring into our souls for probably less than 10 seconds. It seemed like an eternity. It seemed to have accomplished its goal of frightening us and that its mission was complete. My brother and I dashed towards my father's house as soon as it turned its head and disappeared into the woods. We arrived and told him what we had seen, but he didn't believe us. He mistook us for a homeless person or something. Of course, Mom and Dad will never believe anything you say. My brother and I still don't talk about it and prefer to pretend it never happened. That appears to be the simplest way for me to deal with it. My one and only encounter with a werewolf, as I call it, occurred in 2011 when I was 16 years old. I live in the middle of nowhere in Ohio, and it's pretty rural out here. The nearest neighbor is probably a mile away, and there are a lot of woods around our property, but I've never had a problem with that before. Anyway, it was a school night, and I was getting ready for bed by playing some video games. So it's probably around 9:30. If I recall correctly, my room isn't the largest, and I have a window right next to my TV, so I could look out my back window while watching TV. So I'm sitting there playing Xbox, and I have a fairly normal window about 5 or 6 feet off the ground, with the curtains open, and it's obviously pitch black outside. At this point, I'm only half paying attention because I'm thinking, what the fuck did some large dog wander by our yard? And then, not even a few seconds later, the entire head pops up into view, and at this point, I'm screaming like a little girl, because this was a huge wolf-like face with a massive head that took up almost the entire span of my window. It had the most terrifying amber eyes and was clenching its teeth at me. What struck me the most was how large its teeth were, even though they appeared to stick out of its mouth even when it wasn't baring its teeth and making no noise. But after screamed and stared at it for a few seconds, I ran out of my room and ran to my parents to inform them that there was an evil dog outside my window. Of course, my father assumed it was an animal, so he grabbed his rifle and went to investigate, but there were no tracks or signs of an animal outside my window. This sighting occurred in 1981, and I now keep my curtains mostly closed. If I recall correctly, I was 11 or 12 years old at the time and we lived on some acreage in the middle of nowhere in Northern California. There are alfalfa fields all around where we lived, including our driveway, which is at least 500 to 600 yards long and extends from our house to the road, with alfalfa fields on both sides now. There are several trees, large fir trees, all around the pathway. One evening, I was dragging the trash cans to the very end of the driveway. It's a pain in the ass, but I had to do it every week because it was my chore. Anyway, I got both cans to the end of the driveway and started walking back towards the house when I felt threatened. It was as if something was pursuing me. I'm not sure if it was instinct or if this creature wanted me to know it was there, but I happened to look up to my left in the fir tree, and there was this hyena-like creature on a branch in the fir tree. That's the best way I can put it. As soon as I looked at it, the face resembled that of a hyena, and it was already staring at me, and that wasn't all. It began to lower its head and growl at me, as if I were prey. It didn't seem to like the fact that I discovered it was there. After about 3 seconds, the thing jumped from the tree onto the road, then into the opposite side of the road, where there's mostly thick forest and brush. Because it was evening, it was quite dark outside. So the only thing I saw was how big it was and that it was a dark color, possibly a dark brown, closer to black. It appears to have a mane, but it was difficult to tell any specific details because of how it was holding onto the branch. The branch beneath was a massive thick arm that was a part of one of the lower branches about 20 feet up. I'm still perplexed as to how that tree managed to hold such a large animal, and I have no idea what it was. But, obviously, I ran back to my house and never told my parents what I had seen. Are they going to believe me when I say I saw a hyena in the trees? Most likely not. This happened to me while driving through central Minnesota when I was younger, and my friends and I used to go on hunting trips all over the country together. It was October at the time, and we were in central Minnesota at the time, specifically near the Mystic River. Now, to give you a better understanding of the situation. There aren't many trees around, just a lot of tall grass and brush. We were driving through the area late at night, and it was quite dark. We were on a long road with about 100 yards ahead of us. We see this massive mass leap into the road, look in our direction, and then leap to the opposite side of the road. When it jumped, it paused for a second and turned to face us. We were far enough away that we couldn't see every detail, but we definitely saw more than we could have imagined. This thing appeared to be a human-wolf hybrid. According to what we saw, it was very shaggy, and had raccoon-like hands. It was also not particularly large. Was extremely lean, but also extremely tall. In retrospect, other than the fact that it looked like a giant brown wolf head, I couldn't make out many other details about the face and head. I do recall it having longer muscles, but I didn't see any teeth or anything like that. Or even glistening eyes. We didn't want to risk running into whatever this thing was once it hopped to the other side of the road. So we floored it and ran out the door. My friend and I have done a lot of hunting together and have never come across anything strange like that. People have even told us about Bigfoot stuff out there, but we've never found any tracks or real proof that it exists. I'm not saying we encountered a werewolf or a creature, it was simply a large animal, it could have been an unknown dog, I'm not sure. But I wouldn't want to be alone with what we saw. Back in 1989, I went camping with my wife and 3 children in a national state park in Northern California. It's been so long that I've forgotten the name of the park where I had a terrifying experience. It's difficult for me to recall that at times because I feel like I've developed PTSD as a result of it. We'd spent the day hiking and fishing, and now we're driving our camper into the national state park. We found a nice spot to pull over and camp for the night. Everything went as expected. We went outside, fired up the grill, and ate some burgers while relaxing in the cool air after it got dark. We all decided to go inside and get some sleep because my children were very young at the time, ranging from 4 to 6 years old, and because it was a full moon that night, and much of the area around our camper was actually illuminated by the moonlight. After falling asleep in our bed next to my wife, our 6-year-old daughter knocked on the door at some point during the night, saying there was a really big dog outside looking in the windows. I simply told her she was dreaming and to go back to sleep, but she persisted and sounded terrified. I told my wife to stay in bed while I went to investigate. I stood up and went outside. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, nor did I smell or feel anything unusual. I went back inside and told my daughter not to worry and that she should relax as soon as I told her that whatever it was must have slammed as hard as it could into the side of our camper because it shook like someone drove headfirst into it at about 40 miles per hour. My daughter and I were thrown to the ground, and my wife and younger children awoke crying and screaming. The only weapon I really had with me was a baseball bat. So here I am in my pajamas, running outside with a bat, thinking someone has run headfirst into the camper, only to find complete silence and the most eerie feeling I've ever felt. I'm not sure if it was instinct or what was telling me, but I knew to turn to my right because I sensed something nearby. I turned to my right, and there, about 20 feet away, was the largest thing, animal, whatever you want to call it, that I'd ever seen in my life, standing at least 10 feet tall. It was massive. I was never a fan of horror films or anything of the like. But, if I had to describe a real-life werewolf based on the movies, this was it in the flesh. It was so massive that its body resembled Arnold Schwarzenegger with black hair, piercing yellow eyes, and long claws. It was darker because it was night, but as I previously stated, the moonlight allowed me to see more than you would expect on a night because it illuminated so much. It was so dark that I couldn't see a lot of the finer details, like muscle definition, but I could see humongous teeth and what appeared to be a giant dog head on top of this abomination of nature. I immediately dropped my bat and ran back inside, locking the camper door. I wasn't sure if that would be enough, so I told my family to huddle together and be as quiet as possible. I lost track of time after that because all I could think about was this thing pacing outside our camper and growling every couple of minutes. It never attempted to open the door or enter our camper, and after a while the sound seemed to fade, and I never went back outside to see if it was still there. The family and I eventually fell asleep, and we left the next morning. I'm not sure what it was, but it's something I'd rather not talk about, and even writing this was difficult for me. I honestly would prefer to forget about it forever. I am a native of Idaho and a retired police officer. Many years ago, while working as an on-duty cop, I experienced a strange occurrence that I was told I couldn't discuss, but I feel differently now that I'm older. It's something I should mention before the rest of the force thinks I'm insane. But you know what? I don't give a damn. You have no idea what happened to my car. It was probably around midnight and I was on the 41 between Sturgeon and Spirit Lake when what I can only describe as an extremely large wolf began running alongside my vehicle, and acting extremely aggressively. I began to speed up and immediately radioed. I had an unknown animal chasing my vehicle and whatever this thing slammed into my car and scratched the entire side of it with whatever claws it had on it. I accelerated even more and eventually lost sight of it. But as I drove further away, I pulled over to the side of the road to inspect the vehicle's damage, and there were long and deep scratch marks all along the side of the vehicle. When I called for backup, they weren't sure what to make of the horror deal. These are claw marks the size of grizzly bear claws, and nothing out there is going to chase my vehicle at midnight, and do that to the car's metal. The next morning, I receive a call from my supervisor, who expressly instructs me not to speak about it or tell anyone about it. Even though I had already told almost the entire force what had happened, this occurred in 1992. And, while I didn't understand the circumstances of the time, now that I'm older and have looked into these kinds of encounters, some things I realized why they now keep things hush-hush. Pay attention to where you are and your surroundings, especially at nighttime, because even if you're an officer. I live and have lived in a very rural area for the majority of my life with no problems. There is a lot of clearing around my house, as well as woods and a cornfield not far away. This property has actually been passed down from my grandparents, who originally settled here and built the house a very long time ago, I believe since the early 1900s. It's been fairly peaceful here with a handful of farming and easy country life living. We stay out here and like it a lot because there aren't many critters and you get away from the city and everything that comes with it, like noise, crime and people. But as I'm learning out here, it has its ups and downs with the strange things that have been happening. Only recently have I noticed some strange noises outside my house during the night, but nothing that has caused me concern. I became aware of some strange noises one evening. It sounded like growling, but I know there aren't any other dogs in the neighborhood except mine. I look out my sliding glass door and see my Labrador barking his head off at this massive wolf human thing that was standing right by the cornfield. It looks like whatever this thing was had just stepped out of the cornfield into the clearing, and my dog was literally flipping shit at this point. My dog is literally snarling and going crazy, and this thing is just standing there. Keep in mind they are only about 20 to 30 feet. This thing had a massive shaggy wolf head and a very lean tapered waist, but it was very defined and very muscular. You could see it breathe, and even though it was shaggy, I could clearly see the muscles on its abdomen and chest, not as ripped as a bodybuilder but still very well built. And this thing had to be quite heavy. It appears that its arms were too long for its body, which I thought was odd after a few moments of watching this go on and not knowing what to do myself. This creature bared its teeth at my dog and prepared to attack. This thing sent my dog into a frantic frenzy, running back to me whimpering, and as my dog ran back towards the house, this thing looked up and just stared at me through the window. I began to panic because I was afraid that this thing would approach the house. What if it pursues me? What if it shows up and tries to harm us? But it never happened. It just sat there and stared at us for a few moments before turning around and returning to the cornfield the way it came. Even though it was only a few hundred yards away, I felt like it was staring into my soul and that this being appeared highly intelligent. I'd never seen anything like it before, but I get the impression it was more than just an unknown animal we happened to come across. I assume it was some kind of alpha predator, but for whatever reason, it seems more interested in my dog than threatened. It moved quickly as well, because it was gone in a matter of seconds, and those cornfields are not easy to navigate. After this happened to me, I decided to do some research online and was surprised to learn how many other people have had similar experiences with very similar beings. I'm actually surprised. Even though the thing bared its teeth at my dog and was about to strike, I didn't have a more aggressive encounter. It just looked at my dog, very curiously, until it was ready to strike. But I'm grateful and counting my blessings. I haven't seen any trace of it since then, and I'm hoping it was just passing through and will leave me alone. I live and have lived in a remote rural area of Mississippi. I've lived here for almost my entire life, and I adore it. I wouldn't change anything. Waking up to the birds chirping and having all the wild critters around my property is one of the best things ever. I've never had any problems with predators attacking my livestock or anything of the sort. However, there appears to be a different story in my area lately. I probably have 6 or 7 other neighbors, and we're all fairly evenly distributed. My neighbors all have livestock ranging from horses to chickens, goats, cats, and dogs. God bless my next-door neighbor. Her heart is filled with raccoons and possums. She's almost 80 years old and will bring any animal into her house as her own, though some of her animals have gone missing recently. My neighbor on the other side of my property, a little further out, has found his chickens and goats mutilated. He's lost about 10 goats and a dozen chickens in the last few years. There are no large alpha predators in the area that would completely mutilate an animal like this. These animals are being shredded rather than eaten. These animals appear to have been thrown into a meat grinder and then emptied into the ground. As I previously stated, I haven't noticed anything unusual with any of my livestock, but I do keep a close eye on them. One early morning, as I was taking a stroll through some of the acreage behind my house, I noticed things that seemed out of place with how quiet it was usually in the early morning. The forest is alive with bird sounds and small animals scurrying around. This morning, however, despite the fact that the sun was shining brightly, it was dead silent. I'm not familiar with hunting, but it was a little unsettling to say the least. A small lake is not far into the property. This thing isn't too big, perhaps the size of a football field. So it's nice to be able to go back there and sit at the bank and just relax from time to time. That's where I intended to go this morning. And, despite my discomfort with the complete silence, I tried my best to ignore it. It only took me about 5 or 10 minutes of walking to reach the clearing, from which I could see the entire lake. I came to a halt for a moment to take in the scenery. Things appeared to be a little more eerie than they had been. Things were still quiet, and I could feel the hair on my body rising. I became very aware that something was nearby, but I wasn't sure what. Maybe there was a mountain lion nearby, and I was being followed. Just then, across the lake in the woods, I heard crashing noises that sounded like a stampeding moose. I was perplexed by this until I noticed a large, upright canine step right out of the woodline, take maybe 5 or 6 strides, and walk back into the woodline on the other side. This thing walked into another clearing across the lake from me. But this clearing wasn't very big on one side of the woods, it was only about 30 to 40 feet from where the other woods began, and that's where this thing walked into. From where I was, all I could see was a large grey wolf standing upright and walking. I was more perplexed than scared. So I went to see my neighbor later that day and told her what I saw. Beth, the animal lover, told me she didn't want to say anything because she didn't want anyone to think she was crazy. But she has seen the same animal, a large, grey upright canine, on her property, chasing her livestock. Her husband had died a long time ago, so she had no way of chasing it away or defending herself. There are unknown animals in the woods that we haven't discovered yet, and as long as they stay away from me and my property, there will be no problems. Back in 1990, I was living in Kane, Pennsylvania, with my wife's family, assisting her father with his new business. Life was pretty normal for the most part, and while I'm not really a country person, I like where we live. Kane is a small town, so life was relatively simple for the most part. But one evening, I was driving east on Highway 6 outside of town. I'm not sure where I was on the road, but I was startled when this large canine stepped out onto the road on the other side of the road. It was getting late in the afternoon, but not quite evening. It was brown in color and had man-like legs. They did not bow like a normal dog. It was strange. The head was massive. It resembles a massive German shepherd. Because it was so strange, I assumed it was a person in a suit at first, and it never turned to look at me or anything. It just kept going and didn't seem to notice me. I didn't notice any eye shine or anything else. I didn't notice any teeth or anything, but I did notice it had a longer muzzle. It happened so quickly. I couldn't quite remember what his hands looked like. It took such long strides. At first, I knew there was no way it could have been a person. I thought it was a man in a suit or something, as I mentioned, or maybe someone was just playing a trick, but it looked far too realistic, and I'm still trying to convince myself that it wasn't what it was, but I'm pretty sure it was. It was also 7 or more feet tall, which I can't quite wrap my head around. Even so, it was only about 50 feet away when it emerged onto the road and crossed. So I only slowed down slightly. It was an incredible sight to behold. Even though I was scared, I talked to other people in town to see if they'd seen anything strange or bizarre, and no one really talks about anything. My wife and her family have lived in this area for a long time, and have never seen such an animal. Who knows, maybe I just got lucky and saw one. Nobody else gets to see it. We moved to Maine a few years later and have remained there ever since. I've returned to Kane several times since and have yet to see or hear anything similar. Summers in Idaho can be brutally hot, especially depending on where you live. I've lived south of Boise for about 5 years now, from 2008 to 2013, and it's a breath of fresh air from the hustle and bustle of the East Coast. I used to live in Tampa for a long time but moved here for a change of pace and a different job field. Of course, moving out here, I never expected to encounter anything like what I did. It's pretty standard. I believe I heard about the skunk ape once or twice as a child, but I never gave it much thought. I've always assumed that stuff was made up. Anyway, it was back in 2013, right before I had to move, and that particular night was quite hot. I was living in a one-story house at the time, and my bedroom window was about 4 feet above the ground. My bed is right next to my window, so I could literally reach over with my arm and close or open the window while I was sleeping. When I bought this house, it needed some work done to it, and the windows all needed to be replaced. I fixed the majority of them, but they still needed screens, and since I rarely opened my windows, I never bothered putting a screen in. It wasn't yet hot enough for air conditioning. So, on this particular night, I thought, what the hell? I fell asleep after slightly cracking my window. That wasn't enough. I awoke at 1 o'clock in the morning, sweating buckets. I know because when I woke up, the first thing I did was look up at my clock, get up, get some water, and then open my window even more because it was quite hot. I didn't just open the window, I cranked it all the way open to let the cool air in, and for some reason, my room decided to collect all the heat in the house and hold it in. I had trouble falling asleep again, but the outside air was so nice and cool. It felt fantastic. I remember faintly waking up to the sound of heavy breathing and dismissing it as half awake, half dreaming. I noticed the heavy breathing became increasingly louder, and I began to suspect something was wrong. I opened my eyes and looked in the direction of the heavy breathing. Outside, about 20 feet away, was a werewolf. That's the only way I can explain it. It had glowing red eyes and claws outstretched, reaching for the open window. I screamed for as long as I could before leaping up and slamming the window shut. I dashed into my kitchen, grabbed a knife, and braced myself for all-out war. I don't think I've ever returned to my room. I just sat on the kitchen floor, huddled, waiting for this monster to break into my house and take me. I was willing to fight for my life. But it was pretty quiet after that, and nothing happened. Perhaps an hour or two later. I must have dozed off because the next thing I know, I'm waking up in the fetal position on my kitchen room floor, still holding a knife. I jump up and run back to my bedroom, where I see my window is still closed and nothing has been disturbed. I ran outside my house last night to see where this thing was and discovered these enormous prints in the dirt. They were enormous, easily 12 inches or more. Growing up, I had a friend who had a few Great Danes, and this prop print dwarfed even their paw prints. Great, I thought, I have a werewolf in the neighborhood. After that, there was nothing I could do or anyone I could talk to. But who's going to believe me on my luck? I ended up getting a really good job offer not even 2 weeks later, roughly 3 hours away closer to northern Idaho. So I moved. I'll never know what happened to that creature, and I feel sorry for whoever ended up living in that house. I'm hoping they don't get the same nightly visitor I did.